Good afternoon, everybody. This works. Excellent. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm just thrilled to see everybody here. My name is Dan Zarilli. I'm the Special Advisor for Climate and Sustainability here at Columbia University. On behalf of Alex Halliday, the founding dean of the Columbia Climate School, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second of and last for the semester signature speaker event for the Columbia Climate School. These speaker series events are a really important part of how we engage with the community. Knowledge exchange is a core part of how we are thinking about how we educate and empower the next generation of climate leaders. And I'm just so thrilled that everyone is here to join with us and to be part of this. Recently, we heard from James Mwangi of the Climate Action Platform for Africa on unleashing Africa's potential for transformation through climate action. Today, you're in for a real treat as we welcome Ertharin Cousin to the Columbia Climate School. So Ertharin is the founder and CEO of Food Systems for the Future and former U.S. ambassador to the UN agencies for food and agriculture. And she's going to be sharing with us today her thoughts on food system transformation, why we are all responsible. We are all responsible. And so Ertharin currently serves as the CEO and Managing Director of Food Systems for the Future, a nutrition impact investment fund. She's a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, a Bosch Academy Robert Weisacker Fellow, and is a visiting scholar at the Stanford University Center on Food Security and the Environment. She led the United Nations World Food Program, which fed more than 80 million people each year. Before that, she served as the U.S. ambassador to the UN agencies for food and agriculture in Rome. She's a graduate of the University of Illinois at Chicago and the University of Georgia Law School, and has been listed numerous times on the Forbes 100 Most Powerful Women list, as the Fortune Most Powerful Women in Food and Drink, on Times' 100 Most Influential People list, and as one of the 500 most powerful people on the planet by Foreign Policy magazine. So amazing. We're just so thrilled to be able to have you here today. Without any further ado, let me turn the stage over to you. So Ertharin Cousin, please give a hand.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me tell you a little secret about being on all those lists before we get started here. It's not about me, it's about your title. And one of the things I always like to say to students is don't define yourself by your title. You will have friends who you will make friends that you didn't even know that people knew you, but they don't know you, they know your title. And so much of those fortune and time and all of that was very much because I had the honor and the privilege of representing the United States as the U.S. ambassador for food and agriculture and serving as the executive director of the United Nations World Food Program. And it was those institutions and the work that they perform that led to my distinguished honors that were just related to you. But I'd like to think that the work that I am doing with colleagues, allies, and others around the globe today to try and address the issues of the transformation of the food system will one day earn me, in my own standing, a recognition on at least one of those lists. But we'll see what happens. So, happy to be here with you today, and I am going to try to get through this without coughing and without losing my voice. I told Caroline Edelman, who was kind enough to invite me to present to you today, several months ago, in fact, and when we locked in this date, I said I could not call you and say, I have a cold. You would never understand. So, muddle through it. And if you all will work with me and we can get through this together, I'm hoping that by the end of our time together, I've given you a little more information about the transformation of the food system, the challenges that we're facing, the opportunities ahead of us, and why we are all responsible and we must all take responsibility. You know, when we talk about food systems transformation, it's critical to a climate discussion. And so that is why I'm so pleased to be here at the Climate School. When I attended COP26 in Glasgow, food and agriculture weren't even on the agenda. Now, imagine that. And then you'll, as we go through this conversation today, and I tell you how the food system is impacting our climate and the impact that the climate has on our food system, you'll understand why those of us who knowing that food and agriculture weren't on the agenda, attended Glasgow anyway, to make sure that when we were at COP27 in Egypt the following year, that food and agriculture were indeed on the agenda. And it was. But what did we were able to get food and agriculture on the agenda in the final declaration of COP27. You had agriculture and food security, but not food systems included in the declaration. So now we're headed to COP28. And the goal at COP28 is that this is, as the UAE has said, the food COP. So we'll see. Maybe we'll actually get more than 3 words in the 15,000 word declaration coming out of the climate summit. And I say that in a jovial way, but this is very serious business. That these issues are issues that for so long the climate community, the environmental community have not addressed head on. And there's a reason for that. And I just skipped a slide. Let's start. Oh, I'm moving the wrong slides. I'm moving my slides and not yours. Let's see if I can do this. There we go. All right. So at Glasgow, it was, instead of food and agriculture on the agenda, there was a day for nature-based solutions to discuss what was necessary to address the issues of water, biodiversity, and land use. Look at this picture. And we start with, as you can see, in 2020, where we are losing some millions of species across the globe. And the goal of net positive nature-based solutions, moving us to a full recovery by 2050. What's missing from that picture? Anybody? The people are missing from the picture. We are saving the environment for the environment and for nature. This has been a battle, a historic battle between the agriculture community and the environmental community for the last 50 plus years. And there's a reason why, because our food systems are broken and they do affect our environment. You know, our food systems are a major driver of climate change and biodiversity. We've talked about that. You look at 77% of habitable land, excuse me, 49% of that is used for agriculture. And historically, the way we have performed, particularly since the Green Revolution, agriculture in this across the entire globe, is it's been very much, we continue to expand. Extensification as opposed to intensification of agricultural production. The land goes bad, we move to more land. We talk about reforestation as a big piece of business in the environmental community for addressing the issues of addressing the issues of climate, but we don't accept that reforestation, the reason areas were deforested in the first place was because people needed to feed themselves. And unless we address agriculture, we can't sustainably address the deforestation issues. We know that agriculture uses 75% of fresh water. The fresh water draws on an annual basis, and I should say food systems. And let me talk about the difference between agriculture and food systems from a very top line, and then we'll go more into details, we'll go on, but just for this part of the discussion, agriculture is food, fuel, and fiber. We often forget that it's not just about the food system. So most of what I'm going to talk about here today, though, is specifically about the food system. Recognizing, as I was saying to Caroline earlier, that I could do a complete course, a lecture on just each one of these slides. But understanding that when we talk about that 75% annual freshwater draw, that's for the entire food system production, from agriculture through processing, through human consumption, our washing of food, our cooking of food is 75%. And I talked about the extensification as opposed to intensification on land that's already under cultivation as the historical way that we increased our agricultural efficiency. When I say the food system is broken, it's broken from the standpoint of sustainability, but it is the most efficient, particularly here in the United States, production of food that we've ever had in the history of mankind. I am not an anti-green revolution person. We stopped major famines because of the Green Revolution. But what my mother always says is when we know better, we should do better. The Green Revolution was based upon our science and knowledge at the time of increasing the agricultural production through chemicals and increased use of water. And of course, there were impacts that we can spend some time talking about, and we will as we go on. But that extensification affected native habitats, biodiversity, water usage, etc. Monocultures, let's all talk about the monarch butterflies and the effect that monocultures have on butterflies and bees and the other species that thrive on diverse agricultural production. But when you go to monocultures, we have had a detrimental impact. We have all been reading recently about the runoffs from the overuse of inputs and the effect that has not only on the soil and the groundwater of the area under cultivation, but on surrounding areas and lakes and streams in which that runoff of those inputs where it eventually lands. So I debate many in the industry, and I should say this, I'm on the board of Bayer. Bayer bought Monsanto. I went on their board because there's a role for big ag in our need to feed the world, but we can't do it the way we've always done it. But I recognize how we got here. So moving on, we're here. Okay, what did I do? So when I say the food system affects climate, indeed, even if we don't want to talk about it, 35% of all greenhouse gases are emitted by the food. And we often talk about carbon, and now there's more conversation about methane from cows burping and from manure. We don't talk about nitrous oxide because nitrous oxide is in fact present from natural sources, including trees and peat moss and other sources, other natural nature-based sources that emit nitrous oxide, but our use of inputs has increased year over year, the amount of nitrous oxide that are online, folks. You can't hear me. Oh, okay. Now it's going to sound really, I can fake it with my bad voice in person, but the challenges are not nitrous oxide has 300 times the effect on our environment as carbon and methane. And this chart is a busy chart because it's important that you understand that it's not just one. The food system is so complicated. And you often hear people say, well, we should just all stop eating meat. And if we stopped eating meat, then we would eliminate the majority of greenhouse gases. That's back again to who are we saving the planet for? And recognizing that the problem of meat consumption is a problem that we have here in the United States and in Europe, but not in other parts of the world. So we're going to dictate to them based upon our bad habits. And maybe it's we should eat less meat, and that will affect the animal-based consumption. But we also, there's greenhouse gases that are emitted from the plant-based development of food as well as the movement of food. And we have a global food economy. And that's not going to change anytime soon, though we are seeing more investment in regional and local production systems. The reality is the majority of the crops that we consume, particularly the corn, soy, wheat, rice, are produced in one part of the world and move to another part of the world. And that also has an impact on greenhouse gases. Food waste as part of the food system. If the food system is 35% of all the greenhouse gases emitted, food waste is 26% of that 35%. And there you can see there's an equal loss of food in the North and in the developing world, in the South. And the reality is in the North, our food waste is at the retail and consumer level. And the South, the food waste is in between the farm gate and consumer, because of lack of access to storage, transportation, refrigeration. So 40% of the food that is produced on farm is lost before it ever reaches market. And in fact, when I was executive director of the World Food Program, we often said that if we could address the issues of food waste, that was more food than the entire humanitarian community was bringing onto the continent of Africa on an annual basis. But what about the people? Because this is where I spend most of my time, is the effect that this system is having on the people. Today, 834 million people are food insecure. The primary drivers of food insecurity today are conflict and climate. And as we are sitting here talking this afternoon, in Somalia, for example, they are experiencing their 5th year of record-setting droughts. And whether or not there has been or is or we're on the verge of a famine in Somalia is a political issue, not an issue of babies dying, because babies are dying because of climate and the effect of climate on crops and livestock. Even more startling for most people is we have close to 8 billion people. 3 billion people cannot afford a diverse, nutritious diet. 3 billion people. And so I often hear the hand goes up and says, don't we grow enough food? And isn't it just about transportation? We grow it in places where it is not, where people don't need food, and we can't get it to places where people do. The reality of it is we grow enough calories. We don't grow enough nutritious food. 70% of the food that we consume, back to those commodities again, wheat, rice, corn, soy. Those are not the nutritious calories that support the transformation of the food system that we want, that supports our environment and human health. And so when we think about how do we change the food system, it's also about what we plant, where we plant it, how we distribute it. I put this 345 million acutely hungry number here because whenever I put the 834 million people who are food insecure, people say, well, Ertharin, they're just hungry maybe once or twice, 3 times a year or a month. Right now, there are 345 million people who, without humanitarian assistance, would be in that category of the 49 million people who are teetering on the verge of starvation. And all of this, much of this, is driven by climate. And we could take a walk around the globe at the droughts, the floods from Madagascar to the Sahel in West Africa, to the floods last year in India. We can go on and talk about where these people are located, and you will see that it is directly related to how our climate is changing. And the opportunity that we have, we won't, and we haven't been able to embrace the changes that are necessary, or perform the work that is required because of the lack of access to funding. We're all familiar with the fact that the FAO says that the agriculture system, a sustainable agriculture system, is valued globally at $2.3 trillion. But it's also important that you note this number over here, that it will take an investment of $1.3 trillion annually for us to achieve a just and sustainable food system. And that's not happening, as we see that the number of deals in the ag and food sector are, like, if any of you are in the finance space know, last year was a bad year for the venture community. And food and ag historically were not darlings of the venture community because they just did not return fast enough. But we saw an explosion of deals in 2019, 2018, 2019, 2020, et cetera, until last year when it fell back to 216 deals totaling $29 billion, with only about 600 million of that being in sub-Saharan Africa. We saw I just, for giggles and laughs, added these numbers of things that were really hot in the early 2020s were e-grocery, plant protein products, all of those last year, the funders stepped back from. The new items that came online, and this is where we need to move money, folks, were in tools to manage our farms, whether it's new seeds, it's digital management of an AI to yes, my cold is making me a little taking me off my game a little. But I was saying we saw 1.7 billion invested in farm management, specifically related to digitization, biotechnology, software, and the new tools that will allow us to do sustainable intensification based upon data and science. To manage, to move from extensification to intensification of producing more on land already under cultivation, protecting the soil, using less water, providing better seeds that are drought resistant and wind resistant, new cover crops for supporting regenerative agriculture. All of those kinds of new tools was where the money went last year. And where folks like me are hoping it goes as we move towards the future. We need it in other areas as well, because we do need new types of foods. that allow us to consume less animal protein. But this is the area that is going to really become the game changer that we're talking about. So with all of the stuff that hasn't happened, I believe we can transform the food system. We can because we must. And so how do we get there? First of all, what I've been hopefully trying to impress upon you and that you've received positively is that this is not just about agriculture, and it is not just about what happens on the farm. It is about recognizing that this is a complex set of systems that takes a significant amount of work simultaneously. We cannot do one piece and then the other. One of the hardest challenges that we have in the food system space is that we don't have a heuristic like the electric car or windmills or batteries that you can point to and say, if we can invest in X, this will change the entire system. We need you to invest in A through Z in order to build the resilience and to affect the entire system. So that means, and this is why I love coming to schools like this, Caroline, and why I never, whether I have a cold or a fever or anything, I always come, is because we need universities and students and academics, because we need the science. There's a lot we don't know yet that we need to know now, fast. Whether it's how do we transform our commodity crop system in a way that will ensure our ability to provide the grains that we cultivate and process on an annual basis to meet the food and fuel and fiber needs of the entire system in a more sustainable manner. What are the tools that we need to bring online in addition to the digital tools that we've been talking about today? We talked a bit about biotechnology and biofortification. The ultra processed foods, everybody gives it a bad rap, but we all eat it. It's not going to, it is part of our diets, but we can do better. What are the ingredient changes? And I spent a significant amount of time with the folks at the International Food Technology Association talking about foods of the future that will allow us to reduce the footprint of the processed foods that we provide. I'm working, for example, with a ramen noodle company that has made a plant-based ramen noodle, and working with scientists from MIT have made it, the ramen noodle now has more protein than kale. And you can read all the ingredients and none of them have 6 syllables. And so that affects how our system works. The challenge of, as I said, we have a global food system with long supply chains. And when you talk to those in the trade industry, they will tell you we need to grow food where it grows best in trade. That is the part of it's not only part of our food system, it is part of our global economic system. But that all comes at a cost. So what does that look like in the future? How do we change our shipping mechanisms, our refrigeration mechanisms in a manner that will allow us to grow food where it grows best and move it to other parts of the world, but do it in a more sustainable manner? Robotics, AI, and other digital solutions. We talked about sustainable intensification is a must. This should not be a debate about whether or not we use chemicals or don't. Is it organic or agroecology versus intensification using chemical inputs? All of the above is the answer, but all of the above better. is the necessity. To suggest that we must give our soils what they need in order to flourish. Singapore, and I'm sorry, I'm looking at you, Caroline, that said Singapore. It's actually Sri Lanka. Last year made the decision that they were going to embrace organics and use no inputs. Their yields dropped by 50%, food price spiked, and they had a government turnover. There is no global answer to addressing that complicated system that we're talking about. These are ground up answers that these new tools will allow us to develop the right answers for the right places. It also means that there's work for all of us in here too. I talked to a farmer in Iowa. He said, Ertharin, I grow what they pay me to grow. And when the consumer demand does not change, farming is not going to change. What farmers produce is not going to change. What government subsidizes is not going to change. It becomes a responsibility of consumers when to embrace the recognition that how I eat has an impact on how my grandchildren will eat, how my children will eat, and how I may eat 10 years from now, as fast as things are moving. So, and there's a question of affordability when we talk about more varied diets with more nutrients. Because the reality is that that number that I showed you before, that 3 billion people, 41 million of those people live here in the United States who cannot afford a very nutritious diet. And as we talk about diet change, new foods that are coming online for the affluent, coming online for affluent farmers, affluent consumers. And a big piece of business is how do we make all of the tools, whether at the farm level or at the consumer level, available and affordable. So that when we talk about a transformation of the food system, we are talking about a just and equitable transformation of the food system. And I'm not going to read this all to you. We've talked about most of it: reducing weight, cooking at home, shorter supply chains. The Inflation Reduction Act, which has many of our European and Canadian partners quite distraught because of how we're investing in new tools here in the United States. We're also doing it it's not just about batteries and cars, and it's also about agriculture. And there's significant amounts of capital investing. The USDA will invest over the next couple years in regional and local processing, more regenerative agriculture practices, training of farmers to support their uptake of more regenerative agriculture practices. All of those pieces are part of getting to that transformation of the food system. But it's not just about government. If we don't have private sector involved in this, we're not going to get there. It takes collective action. That big number that I talked about in the front that we require for investment on an annual basis to transform the food system, much of that will come from private sector. Because this is not charity. This is the opportunity to make this transformation will result in financial return to investors, as well as to the impact that we need to change and transform the food system and provide better access to more affordable foods and foods that are produced more sustainably. But that kind of collective action, when we talk to private sector, we need, particularly here in the United States, to not get sidetracked by the political debates around sustainability and private sector investment. Europeans are much further ahead of us on recognizing that this is not about an issue of woke or red or blue politics. And so I spent a significant amount of my time talking to corporations as well about how this is managing risk as they invest for the future. But we also need the ecosystem that is necessary. And that means things like our subsidies for food. There's $700 billion in agricultural subsidies globally. And much of that money subsidizes the agriculture system that we've been talking about here this afternoon. And so if we want to change how that system operates, we need to change those subsidies. And that does not mean taking money from one place and giving it to another. It means, as I was saying before, farmers will transform based upon where the money flows. We will produce differently based upon the regulations and the subsidy support that businesses and other actors receive. We also need to change the standards. Now, I get into real debates with many of my friends who would suggest things like we should make SNAP beneficiaries unable to use their SNAP benefits for sugary drinks or snacks. And I said, so they're going to carry all of us on their backs? You know, why those who have the least would we put the burden on them to say you can no longer use your assistance that you receive to buy indulgence foods? Indulgence foods are going to be a part of our future. They just can't be at the center of our plate. And they can't be the only things that we're subsidizing. So we need standards that are reasonable and that are equitable and just, that drive us towards the change in behaviors that we need. So I've talked about repurposed subsidies, open markets, better land management. All of these are big pieces of business. Taxes and fines, our Europeans are leaning into taxes and fines. They are a complete non-starter in the United States. Whether we're talking about increased taxes on sugary beverages. I think you all have that here in New York though, don't you? Yeah, it failed. And half the council in Chicago lost the next election as a result. So that's not something that the US is embracing as an answer, but we do need to catalyze and support consumer behavior change. So I threw this slide in here because this is important to me. I cannot leave an audience like this without proselytizing just a little. We are in a situation where, as we talk about our food system, we know that our food system is wreaking havoc on our environment as well as on our human health. And so the answer from many in the community has been food is medicine, and medically tailored meals and providing prescription produce. And I said, why do we wait until the onset of disease before we make food affordable and available? Why don't we embrace a real healthcare system and food is health and provide access to nutritious food that will avoid the onset of disease? Building into the system those supports that are necessary that we talked about on the last slide that will provide access regardless of income or geography. So we can get there. Look at the sunshine on the horizon. We can get there. With the right policies, changing consumer demand, providing the access to capital. Without the money, this is all just a really interesting conversation. But without the partnerships, the capital, the policies are not going to drive the change that we need at the level that is required to support the transformation, because we're not talking about fixing the system around the edges. We're truly talking about transforming the system. And we're all in this because this is not a problem over there. I can quote you as many numbers of people who are affected right here at home as I can of people who are affected in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, or Latin America. As a percentage of population, you're absolutely right. But if we have 41 million people here who can't afford a healthy diet, or 35 million people who depend upon a food pantry for their diets, or we've lost, in 1910, we had 1.2 million Black farmers in the United States. Today, we have less than 55,000 because of the lack of access to the appropriate subsidies and support that is necessary for them to compete. Now, we can have a debate about, yes, we've lost medium-sized and small farmers of every race. But that does not diminish the fact that all of the activities that we have undertaken over the past 40 years of our development of this very efficient and effective food system, both here at home and globally, have impacted the poorest and most vulnerable the most. And as a result, that creates the kind of potential friction. And no, I'm not going to say that hunger leads to conflict. Done a lot of research in this area. There's a correlation, but not a causal link between hunger and conflict. There is a direct correlation between conflicts and a direct causal link between conflicts and hunger. But much like climate, it's a factor that does affect, and it will affect us not just in the long term. As we see population movements, we see climate refugees, we see hunger refugees. This is an opportunity for us to embrace what is possible and invest in the work that is necessary to make the changes. So I love talking to audiences like this of people who are interested in these issues and those who have the academic and intellectual capacity to make a difference. We're depending on you to join in. And I appreciate it, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It's amazing. I know there's gonna be a ton of questions, and I know that we're probably heading a little close to time. So hands up. I would love to just hear some questions from the audience for Ertharin. See firsthand. So
thank you so much, Ambassador, for that talk. I really enjoyed your observations. Perhaps a question regarding the global governance of a lot of this, given your experience on the diplomatic front. What kind of reforms would you like to see prioritized at the level of WFP and FAO? It's an inevitable question, but I nonetheless would like to hear your thoughts, given that there's a lot of competing ideas out there, a lot of different priorities being pushed by different developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts at this moment in time on what is absolutely essential first and foremost?
We must have a social safety net, whether it's a domestic social safety net or a global social safety net, and WFP provides that. And last year, with the after COVID and Russian invasion into Ukraine and the increase in the numbers of people who were acutely hungry, WFP raised a record $14 billion and fed over 100 million people last year. The reality is we need preemptive humanitarian response, which means we need FAO, WFP, EFAD working together to not just provide the food that farmers and those in rural areas, because that's where most of the most vulnerable populations are located, but to also provide those tools that will support that sustainable intensification, that regenerative agriculture, that will increase the productivity of the agriculture in those areas where people are vulnerable to climate, the impacts of climate. Because other than that, we're going to feed the same population every year when the rains don't come. And so the problem is, as I had one bureaucrat who say to me, I wish I had all the money you think that I have to invest in all the different areas, that you invest based upon priorities. But we need the community of development humanitarian actors to get out of their silos and recognize that we're serving the same people, but we're not serving them well enough because we serve them in our silos.
Yeah, thank you so much. I had a question. You showed a slide that had percentages and amounts of money that were invested earlier on, and showing the number, I think was at 1.3 billion that were being invested where it needs to go in farm management. And then percentages with the hot, trendy alternative meats. Do you happen to know off the top of your head, what are the numerical values? Like, what was the money that was going into these alternative meats and other hot, trendy food items? Was that enough to go where it needs to cover the farm management?
No, it wasn't. And it's not a one-for-one trade-off. And I don't want to suggest that it is. And there are a number of sources, from McKinsey to agro finance, that all accumulate on an annual basis the amount of money that goes into each one of these areas, that can tell you specifically where the money went last year and where it didn't go. So off the top of my head, I don't have those figures in front of me right now.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. What I'm wondering is, a lot of this has to do with investments and things like that. What is something that like I as a student or others can do just on like an everyday scale to help?
The students, I love young people. You're fearless and you're not afraid to speak truth to power. You look at some of the young people in Europe, Greta Thunberg, for example, and the attention that she gets from leaders around the globe because students listen, and you can stand up, and this is your world. You know, in Germany, the Supreme Court in Germany actually found the Bundestag in violation of its duty of care to future generations for failing to pass climate legislation that was stringent enough to address the challenges of the climate crisis. You never get our Supreme Court to do that here, but the reality was that you have voice, you have standing. And you need to use that, because when I will never forget, I was on the elevator. I could tell stories all day. I was on the elevator with an elected official, and he was reading his phone, and he said, "Hey, Ertharin, still feeding the babies?" And I said, "Yeah, that's what I do. I make sure I work on feeding the babies." And he said, "You know, nobody gives a damn, right?" And then he said, "Oh, no, you know, I'm just kidding." But until last year, we could not get food and agriculture onto the political agenda. And it wasn't until the Russian invasion into Ukraine, with Ukraine being the breadbasket and the effect that that had on global food markets, that we were able to get food and agriculture onto the top of the G7 and G20. And it's still there this year because of the inflation and the effect that that has had on food availability. But we should have these issues on the political agendas every year. And that's going to come from young people using their voices and your ability to convene and to muster support and advocate. That is going to drive the political dynamic that we need to support the change that's required.
Okay, we have one question from our online audience. What policy measures can we implement to disincentivize food waste?
Oh, you know, in France, they actually implemented a policy to fine businesses for disposing of food waste. Again, fines are not a policy that I see as a catalyzing factor that is available here in the United States. But the driving more of a reward system where you reduce the taxes for collection of waste if X percentage of that waste is donated. And in California, where you are required to separate the waste, they have a very intricate waste management system. It drives a certain behavior amongst consumers on how they dispose of all of their waste, including food waste. And those are the kinds of, we need more of those kinds of creative solutions that people will not see as punitive to the point where we cannot get political traction around them. I am a pragmatist. I am looking for the solutions that we can get past. And we can't wait until our political climate changes before we pass the solutions that are the regulations and standards that are necessary for us to change things like how we dispose of food waste. But we need those kinds of solutions that are pragmatic, that are going to be probably more local than national, and that we can adopt and share and partner at the municipal level, because much work is happening at the municipal level around many of these issues related to food waste that we just don't have enough visibility on today. So let's get done what we can do without bemoaning the challenge of the politics.
I think I'm going to take host prerogative and maybe take the last question. There's a lot of conversation in the climate space around systemic change versus individual behavior change, and you're touching on that a little bit here. And I'm wondering if you see is it a similar dynamic the way it is in the energy space with fossil fuel companies and individual users and how they use energy versus the food system versus all of us as consumers of food? Is there a corollary in your mind in those, or is there a distinct food version of that?
No, there's no, I love the energy space, and we steal a lot from the energy space because they're much further ahead in their organizing and their advocacy than we are in the food system space. And there was a time when many in the food system space wanted to argue that we needed systemic change. We could not do enough as individuals to drive change. I argue that's a cop-out because of how our food system works, and so much of it is driven by demand, that if you don't have the individual change as well as, it is not a replacement for, it is a both must do in order to drive to the outcome that we want to achieve. That you need that individual action as well as the systemic changes and structural changes that are necessary to support that individual consumer demand. Because it doesn't help if everybody starts demanding meat that is produced through sustainable livestock management, but we don't have enough farmers producing meat through sustainable livestock management. So we need them both to occur simultaneously, much as you need in the energy and transportation system as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Can we get a round of applause for Ertharin? Thank you so much. Really amazing. I think we're gonna, as we're wrapping this up, we're gonna be able to mingle in the room and ask some questions. Bar's open, food's in the back. Don't run out the door, and we can have a nice little conversation without a microphone. Thanks, everybody, and thanks everyone for being online and joining us as well.